verses 7 through 12. On the first day of the week, we came together to break bread. Paul spoke to the people, and because he intended to leave the next day, he kept on talking until midnight. There were many lamps in the upstairs room where we were meeting. Seated in a window was a young man named Eudicus, who was sinking into a deep sleep as Paul talked on and on. When he was sound asleep, he fell to the ground from the third story and was picked up dead. Paul went down, threw himself on the young man, and put his arms around him. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "He is alive." Then he went upstairs again and broke bread and ate. After talking until daylight, he left. The people took the young man home alive and were greatly comforted.
So it's been fun the last couple of weeks to see all these different celebrations in baseball of these division championships. I admit I get a little nostalgic when I see these division celebrations. You see these guys that are, all worked up and having these big parties, big celebrations, and of course, they have a whole lot of work left to them. But on those years that the good guys win those division championships, they're kind of fun. But it's a there's the thing about it is the thing about historically, like the sports that I follow, there's been a trend of devaluing the season. I play in a league, and we go through the season, and we have all this fight for our record, and then everybody makes the playoffs. Professional sports aren't that far away. Like, you have all of this, long season. There's 162 games they play in baseball, and they get done with it, and now something like 40% of the teams go right on into this little playoff thing. But the marketing of professional sports, they tend to value the hot team over the best team. They'd like to have some hot team, go through October and win a few games. And it's true in hockey and basketball, and it's all these big sports. They kind of let about as many people as they can into this playoff thing because it increases ratings, they get more money. But what is lost in that is the sense of value or the meaning of that long haul. There's something about winning. Actually, in the old days for baseball, it was just winning their league. They didn't have divisions, so you kind of make it through 162 games and you wind up in first place. You won your league and you get to go play in the World Series. There's something about valuing there's a value in perseverance, of making it through the long haul, surviving all of this marathon to make it to the end and to be the one that emerges as the victor. There's something powerful in that. And that sense of the long haul, that sense of perseverance, is right here front and center in Acts chapter 20. We're in a transition period in the book of Acts, and we have seen a pairing here late in this third missionary journey of Paul's work of building and then strengthening churches. And that's been a pairing that's existed throughout Paul's ministry. He goes, he preaches and proclaims the gospel, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile. Some respond well, some want to kill him. But those that respond well, there is this emergence of this church. And one of the themes that's been echoing throughout the book of Acts is seeing how God is building his church from every nation and tribe and tongue, from all peoples, from all these walks of life, that he's building this church. But it's not just notches on a belt. Paul just doesn't show up, preach the gospel, some buy into it, and then he moves on to the next town. You see this pattern that Paul keeps going back to build them up. There's a pairing of this work of mission and evangelism with a ministry of discipleship. He seeks out new converts. He seeks to explain the gospel, to proclaim it, to show this new reality of what God has done through Jesus Christ. And that is paired with this ministry of encouragement and strengthening, helping those churches grow in depth as much as he's also seeing them grow in number. That he's not interested in a church that is a mile wide but an inch deep. He wants to see the churches grow deeper. And you have this here as we turn to really probably the favorite story of preachers, right? Eudicus. And it's tempting as you turn to the story of Eudicus because really, you can stay at a surface level of this reading. And that's a pretty fun reading because it turns out that if you fall asleep during a sermon, you may die. And that's a good lesson, right? And it's a wonderful lesson like say it's a preacher's favorite story because it's a wonderful standard, a wonderful benchmark to have, because why did they fall asleep? Because he was preaching until midnight. And I got to say, I don't think I've ever preached until noon. So I've got a lot of space here, and I feel convicted in Acts 20 that I just need to preach longer, because he preaches till midnight, and then when the guy dies, he brings him back to life and then keeps preaching until dawn. So, there's a lot here at the surface level, but I think as you go through it, and I want to read through the story and work it through twice, because I think if you see multiple readings invite us to really, I think some deeper things are happening here. And he's really calling us to something that's quite profound. But let's start with the first reading. Let's start with what I'll call the historical reading. Let's just read it as it comes to us here in Acts 20. And I want to start not with verse 7, but just to have a quick summation of those first 6 verses. Because what is happening here, where are we at historically? This is really a long journey to Jerusalem. He's making his way home. He's going to make his way back to Antioch. Eventually, he's making his way back to Jerusalem. He's heading to Jerusalem with the intent of a lot of things. Actually, we know from reading Paul's letters, what's happening here is that he's going there with a gift. He's bringing them, he has raised money from all these churches throughout Asia, throughout the Gentile world, and he's bringing that money to them because Jerusalem's having a hard time, because they're in the midst of a famine. They're in the midst of all this thing. The church in Jerusalem is suffering, and Paul is strategically seeking to build a connection between the Jewish and the Gentile churches and Jewish and Gentile Christians by showing how Gentile Christians right now in a place of prosperity can help those in the Jewish Christians in Jerusalem in a place of suffering and hardship. Actually, what's interesting is Luke doesn't talk about any of that. We don't know why. Why does Luke not mention it? But what he does mention is that journey to Jerusalem. And what is he there and doing? Verse 2 gives us that theme that resonates throughout the section. He'd gone through these regions and he had given them much encouragement. That theme of encouragement is what Paul is doing in the course of his travel to Jerusalem. He's building up the church. He's strengthening them. He's calling them to keep on, to keep pressing on. And he's spending some time there. Verse 3, he's spending 3 months there in Macedonia as he's encouraging this. And in the course of it, he's facing opposition. That says there in verse 3 that there was a plot against him by the Jews. We don't know much about it. You notice that Luke is compressing a whole lot of stories. Luke is selective in the stories that he drills on. He's just kind of running through a whole lot of time here and a whole lot of mileage in terms of the places that he's visiting. But then he has this long list of names. And I took it easy on Ethan, not making him read all these. But you go in verse 4 on, and you get this long list of names. And the thing, it's less important to figure out how to pronounce them than to just notice that all of these places that they're from, as he's setting sail for Syria, he's returning to Macedonia. And you've got a Berean, you've got somebody from the Thessalonica, you've got somebody from Derbe, it mentions the Asians, Tychicus and Trophimus. There's all of these places represented here. He's missing some from places he's visited. There's nobody here from Corinth, and there's a lot of speculation why. Paul has an up and down relationship with the church in Corinth. That may be what's going on there. But it's almost like he's assembled this gathering of representatives from all these places that he's ministered. Now, some of that historically, they may be going because they're going to bring this gift that they're going to take to Jerusalem. So there may be very simple. But again, Luke doesn't talk about that. What Luke focuses our attention on is this wide gathering, representatives from all these places throughout the Gentile world. People that Paul has shared the gospel with, people that have responded, these representatives of this church that has grown from just this one small gathering there into Jerusalem, into a gathering of churches that are now existing throughout the Greco-Roman world. It's a stunning picture of a church that is being built up and a sense of connection that connects the churches across all these nations and boundaries and languages and culture and all the things that divided them then and divide us now. And there's a remarkable picture of the opportunities we have to connect across the cultures as we are gathered, the sense of unity that we have in Christ. So, then he makes his way here to verse 7. And as he is here gathered to give this to give this talk, then you have this moment of tragedy. Eudicus brings this moment of tragedy into the midst of this community life. So a couple things that happen just on this first layer, just at the historical level. What's going on? He talks about the first day of the week. This is interesting because it's the first reference in Scripture to Sunday worship. There's some debate about, is he talking about, how is he counting the days? Because the Jewish calendar and Jewish ways of counting were different than the Gentile calendar. The Jewish calendar, Jews had a different calendar, but they also had a different way of counting the days. So everything begins at sundown, whereas the Roman world, it begins at sunrise. And so when he talks about the first day of the week in the evening, if it's a Jewish method of counting, then it would be a reference to Saturday night. If it's a Roman method of counting, it would be a reference to Sunday night. Most scholars that have looked at it, that I read, think this is actually a reference to a Roman method, that this is actually Sunday night. And what it's interesting is that Luke is actually, the way that Luke writes the book of Luke and Acts is that he's mostly dealing with a Jewish calendar system, because he has references to Jewish holidays. He just had one back in verse 6. He has a Jewish reckoning of calendars and a Roman reckoning of time, which is kind of interesting. He's really, you see him kind of navigating the two worlds that they're ministering in. But I think that's largely secondary. But you see them gathered on the first day of the week, and that's a model. Of course, we're still doing it today. That's an early practice of the church, that they shift their worship from a primarily Sabbath-oriented worship, a Saturday-oriented worship, to a Sunday-oriented worship, obviously because of its association with the resurrection. So they are gathering here, and he's gathering to break bread. And so there's this sense of, what are they doing there? That image of breaking bread is a picture of fellowship. It's also could be a picture of communion, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But both of those images are there, and actually it's likely that both are happening, because I think it seems the best that we can understand is the common way of doing communion at the time would be to take communion as part of a fellowship meal. That's how they would do it. So they're gathering to break bread, and then Paul begins to talk. Why does he talk until midnight? He prolonged his speech was the translation I had. I think later I think Ethan's translation was, he talked on and on. That's a great picture there. He's just going on until midnight. Well, you see here, the reason why he's doing that is because there's a sense of urgency. You see this as like a farewell moment. Here's his last chance that he has to prepare this church, to arm them, to equip them. So he has so much he wants to share as he encourages them and builds them up. But it goes on, and he keeps on going. There's this urgency as he prepares for his departure. And I think Luke is allowing us to experience this whole setting, gathering up all these representatives of all of Paul's ministry, and now he's going in and talking for hours on end to encourage these churches. There's a sense of urgency. There's also this looming sense of farewell in this, that there's a sense of something's coming to a close. And Luke wants us to feel that. He wants us to see that and see that there's a big transition that's getting ready to happen here. In fact, what's coming is we're reaching the end of Paul's ministry to us as a free man. There's something significant going to be changing in his life in just a short while. And so as he's doing this, then there's this reference to them being gathered in this upper room and lighting these lamps and he's preaching on into the hours. And the reference to the young man in verse 9. The phrase young man, that can mean one of two things. It's most often a reference to, would be like a young boy. It would be somewhere 8 to 14 years old. But it also can be a reference to a slave. There's nothing else in the context that would suggest it's a slave, but it might be. The idea of being a young man, especially someone of that age, would enhance the sense of the tragedy of the situation. But some write about the lamps that they used, that as it would go on for hours on end, that some of these lamps would give off smoke. Here is an upper room, but that smoke could fill the room, and so you could understand that guy having to sit there for hours on end, he seeks fresh air, so there he is gathered at the window, and then there's this sense of the tragedy that he falls asleep. It makes sense as the night would drag on, there's fresh air at the window, and he falls out the window and falls to his death. There's some interesting language that they use there, but it's clear that he is dead, verse 9. And then Paul goes to him, and he bends over to him. And he says he bent over him, and taking in his arms, he said, "Do not be alarmed, for life is in him." And so there's this gracious provision of life that God provides, this miracle to the community in the midst of this kind of odd tragedy, this horrible tragedy that has struck them. That Paul is raising him from the dead, and those are echoes. We're going to talk about those echoes in a minute. But what happens to them? There is life in him, and so he calls him, raises him up, and then what do? They go back, verse 11. He goes right back. They continue to break bread, and they eat, and then he keeps on preaching. He talks until morning as he prepares them. And so he leaves. Verse 12, they took the youth away alive and were not a little comforted, which is an odd phrasing, but it keeps showing up in Luke. But this is a significant picture of the comfort that they get. There's a picture here of this gracious mercy as God has brought life in the midst of a community in need of encouragement. So just at the historical level, just the way that Luke presents the story, you see Paul doing a ministry of encouragement and then providing this miraculous life that he can reverse this tragedy so they can experience even a greater sense of encouragement. And if we stayed there, I think we'd get a lot out of it, and there's much we could do with it. But I think the way that Luke is presenting it to us, I think he's wanting us to hear echoes as he goes along. So let's go through it again. Let's do what I would call the symbolic reading. Let's look at for some of the echoes and references that Paul is doing as he goes through it. You go back right through it. He first says on the first day of the week, and so, of course, it talks about this is the practice of worship. Why do they worship on the first day of the week? It's an echo of resurrection. That's the first thing we would think of, what happens on the first day of the week in Luke and Acts. The first day of the week is the day of resurrection, and so this is a day where he is bringing somebody back to life. That alone should make us think something else is going on here. As they're gathered to break bread, where do we think of breaking bread in Luke and Acts? Well, I think probably there's two places we should go to. We should be thinking of communion. We should be thinking of the fellowship of the church in Acts 2. And I want to reference that again here in a little bit. But you have the first day of the week, and then there, I think, is what really kind of sets a lot of people's imaginations alight when he says, verse 8, there were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered. Why in the world does he take the time to point out these many lamps? Well, let's think about light for a minute. Light has been a recurring theme in Luke and Acts. We've seen a number of references to this Old Testament from Isaiah. The idea of Israel was called to be a light to the Gentiles. Luke 1, Luke 2, Acts 13 makes that reference. And in all of those references, ultimately, is the idea that Jesus is coming to fulfill what Israel was meant to be, which is meant to be a light to the world, a light to the Gentiles. Paul will talk in a few chapters in Acts 26. He talks about how his ministry was to turn people from darkness to light. And he says in that same speech, he talks about how Jesus Christ came to proclaim the light, that Jesus is the light giver, the light bearer, and the light proclaimer. He is the one. He is the light of the world, bringing light into the darkness. There is a lamp here, but it's not just one lamp. There are many lamps. And so that's another thing to think about here. There are many lamps, which focuses on the church. Luke 12, there's an emphasis there of let your lamps be burning. The image of lamps burning, multiple lamps, is an image of the perseverance of the disciples. Well, that's right on par with what we're talking about here, right? This is why Paul is doing what he's doing. He's seeking to encourage the church, to build them up, that they would be a people whose lamps would keep on burning. Well, this is an echo even of Pentecost itself. What happens on Pentecost? But light descends and rests on the heads of all the believers. And that is an image of the empowerment of the Spirit. As the light rests on their head, they are empowered by the Spirit to go into the world and to preach and proclaim the gospel. The image of the many lamps is an image of a church on fire with the Spirit of God, faithfully engaging in mission and going out into the world. And then verse 8, right after the many lamps, where are they gathered? They're gathered in nothing less than an upper room. And again, you can talk about that from a historical perspective, but there's more happening here. What's happening in the upper room? The upper room takes us to the Last Supper. It takes us to Jesus preparing his disciples for his departure. The same thing that Paul is doing right here, preparing them for his departure. As he prepares them for his departure, what is he doing as he gives them, institutes the communion table? It is a table that connects them to him, but also connects them to each other, where they remember who we are, who they are as the people of God. It is in that table that there's a reclaiming of a collective identity to be his followers out in mission to the world. It's the Last Supper. It's Pentecost. Pentecost, the fire descends in the upper room as they are gathered and praying. So all of these upper room is a significant thing. In fact, in Acts 13, when Peter revives Tabitha, he revives her in an upper room. The upper room is this place of new life, of resurrection, a revival that happens. Life comes as the Spirit, as the light descends on a people in these upper rooms. The community here is discovering life in the face of death. It gives us Paul as a kind of Jesus figure, where he is preparing followers for his departure as he goes to Jerusalem. So we're in the upper room. Then you talk about sleep. And the idea of sleep is a significant image in Luke, because sleep is associated with death. Luke 12, verses 35 and following, it gives the parable of those who fall asleep. And as they fall asleep, it's a picture of them falling away, of not persevering. Real faith, genuine faith in Luke is a faith that perseveres. It's a faith that lasts. And in Luke 12, there's that picture of this heavy price that's paid for those who fall asleep, and they are not counted as his. It's a picture of failure. Sleep is a picture of failing in the calling of a discipleship. It's a picture of those who are fallen asleep rather than remaining alert and awake. And again, that's exactly what Paul is doing right here, seeking to encourage and build up and get them to be alert, to be awake. And so here this young man falls asleep. It's a reminder to them of what spiritually can happen to all of them. And there's a calling, the urgency that Paul feels as he calls them to remain alert, to stay awake. Then the image of him when he dies here, what does it say? He was taken up dead, which is a very strange way of saying that he died. But all of that is an echo. It's an echo of several things. It takes us back to Elijah in 1 Kings 17, of Elijah raising the dead. Elisha, 2 Kings chapter 4. I think that's a deliberate echo here, a specific echo in the way that he descends on him. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But all of that has been referenced. We've talked about Elijah and Elisha before because it was echoed with Jesus in Luke 7 as he raises the son of Nain, and in Luke 8 when he raises Jairus' daughter. Both of those are written in a way that create deliberate echoes of Elijah and Elisha as the prophets who raised the dead. And when Luke was first giving us that presentation, we looked at it last year, we were talking about how Jesus is presented as kind of the ultimate prophet. He is doing what Elijah and Elisha does, but he does it better. He does it bigger. And then we saw in Acts chapter 9, a few months ago, Peter was raising the dead. When he's raising the dead, there's deliberate echoes of Jesus and of Elijah and Elisha. And in all of that, what you're seeing is Jesus is a follower, his apostle, his appointed one, is doing the same kind of things that Jesus did. Peter's ministry was focused mainly in the Jewish world, and now Paul, doing it in the Gentile world, is having the same thing happen. Peter and Paul both, God's appointed agents, are life givers, bringing life from death. Now that, I'm not sure that very many people here would say, I know somebody that's brought somebody back from the dead. Now you say, well, does that end with them? I don't know. But I think that's a picture of what he's calling his followers to be. We may not be bringing anybody back from physical death, but we are preaching and proclaiming a gospel that raises the dead to life. And I think as we do our mission and our ministry, we need to be reminded of the significance of what's happening there. So he's taken up dead, and then the next phrase, Paul went down and bent over. And that's a unique, again, way of phrasing it. That is, I think, an echo of 2 Kings chapter 4, when Elisha is raising the dead. It talks about him falling on the person that he's raising from the dead. But what is Paul doing there? If you take all this symbolic language, Paul is leaving behind the lamps. He's walking away from the light and entering into the darkness. Well, that's a place of death in terms of the symbolic language. Paul is leaving the light and entering into the darkness. Why? So that he can restore the one who is being lost to the darkness. Paul is with the light, is going in and bringing life from death. It is a wonderful picture there of grace and hope, where the images would suggest judgment and despair. You could stay with him out in the darkness, that he fell away, and you could end the sermon there and say, see, be careful. Just fall away into the darkness, you're just lost. But that's not the message. Paul enters into the darkness, just as Jesus entered into the darkness. The light of the world comes into a dark world and brings light. Jesus is the giver of light, the creator of light, and the bringer of light. And he enters into the darkness. Not that the darkness deserves it, not that there's somebody in there that deserves rescue, but he enters into the darkness and brings light where it isn't earned, it isn't achieved, but is given through grace. That's what Paul is doing here as he raises the dead. He brings him to life. He enters into the darkness, and light comes. And then after he's risen from the dead, what does he do? He goes back and they break bread. He talks about the broken bread. This is the first mention of breaking bread here in this section, verse 7 and verse 11, since Acts 2:42, verse 42 and verse 46. And what is Acts 2:42 and 46? That's a picture of the church in the wake of Pentecost. After 3,000 are baptized, you have this new gathering of people. The Spirit of God has descended on them. And it talks about the people who are devoting themselves to three things. The church devotes itself to the teaching of the apostles, the fellowship, and the breaking of the bread. All three things are happening right here in this upper room. All three things are happening, and happen all the more joyously in light of the life that they have seen given. As they have seen Eudicus come to life, they can break bread and they can fellowship. He talks about in breaking bread and eating. He converses with them, and the teaching. He continues to teach. What happened among the Jewish believers in Acts chapter 2, it's kind of this kind of picture of this idealized sense of what a church could be, is now happening among the Gentile believers. So this picture of a church awakened to life is not just something for the Jewish people, it's for the Gentile people, it's for all who would respond to the gospel of Jesus Christ. What sustains God's people here is his word, his church in fellowship, and his banquet table that he sets for his people. And those three things are all happening here. And then finally, you see him depart. And that picture of him departing, he leaves his people comforted and full of life. And where does that take us to? No less than the ascension itself. That as Jesus ascends, he leaves behind his people armed and equipped with the Spirit of God, his presence. He says, I will always be with you. He's always with them through his Spirit. And so with the Spirit among them, with the presence of Jesus given to them through the Spirit of God, they are called and equipped to go out and preach and proclaim and to be the church, to be the light that they share and spread to the world. Jesus departs and provides for his people in abundance. Paul departs and provides for his people in abundance. So in summary here, as you take kind of this symbolic look, I hope you can see there's something deeper going on here. That when we come through these 6 verses of Eudicus, you emerge with just a deeper and renewed appreciation for who Jesus is. That we see Jesus as the one who brings the light to the darkness, who's bringing life to the dead. That you see something of what Paul and the apostles were doing, the apostles themselves, as they are carrying on his mission of bringing light to all peoples. that the light that Jesus brings now rests on them, and they bring it to the world. And now you see a deeper vision of who the church is. That we as the church are the ones called to carry that light, to have that light on us, to keep it lit, and to go out and to not fall into darkness, to resist the temptation to just fall away, to do nothing. But as we carry that light, we go out and we rescue those who have fallen into darkness, not by our strength or our power, but by the power of the light that we carry, given to us by Jesus himself. And that's the story of Eudicus. It's a story of perseverance. And that's the calling that's on us. That's the thing that Paul is wanting us to see, that God is calling us to perseverance, to a faith that lasts, that God helps us persevere, that actually he is working to have us persevere through the light of his word that he gives us. We dwell richly in his word. We meditate on his word. We gather before his word. We hear his word. And we know that in that his word is the life that we need. That he helps us persevere through the table, through the fellowship that we have, because that fellowship is first with him, that we have a fellowship with Jesus that we proclaim week in and week out, and we kind of symbolically participate in that banquet table through bread and wine. And then it's also a fellowship that we have with one another, that we gather as the people of God to preach and proclaim. We proclaim in action as we take bread and wine, that we proclaim something about who Jesus is and about who we are as God's people. And that table becomes a representation of something much larger, which is the fellowship that we have with one another as we seek to love and encourage one another, as we seek to walk with each other through the ups and downs of our life and our lives together, as we seek to encourage each other, to remind each other, this is the Word of God. Here's the light of the world. All of that is the ways in which God helps us to persevere. God's true church is a persevering church. He calls us to dwell in the light, to persevere in his power, and then to bring that light into the darkness, that we might see others come to life through his grace and through his power. Let's pray. God, I thank you for your grace. I thank you that you are one who gives life from death. I thank you that you do not leave us in our darkness, but that your light goes out into the world and brings life where there is only death. God, I pray that you will help us to dwell richly in the beauty and the power of your word, of the beauty and the power of this fellowship that you've called us to, and the fellowship that we proclaim week in and week out as we gather at the table. I pray that you will shape our hearts, that we will persevere in faith. And as we do so, God, I pray that you will give us hearts that ache for those who are in darkness. Perhaps those that we once saw in the light that have now are gone, and to those who've never heard, who've never taken that step into the light. Thank you for the light